All right, let's take this discussion further now. We are joined via video link by Trevor Shaku, spokesperson for the South African Federation of Trade Unions, as well as in studio, Matshidiso Lencoasa, Chairperson for the Budget Justice Coalition and budget researcher, and she is joining me live in studio. Let's start with you, Trevor, and very good afternoon to the both of you. I mean, there were about 158,000 more people who were unemployed in Q2 than in Q1. Firstly, let's get your reaction as a union, and also just look as we're looking into these, factors that are contributing, of course, to the rise in unemployment. I don't know how much of our bulletin you've been listening to, but some of these figures have really been described as shocking.
Look, for us, these things are not shocking. Of course, they are a cause for concern, but they are not shocking. The reason they are not shocking is because we have lamented as the South African Federation of Trade Unions that the structural fault lines in the economy are the ones responsible for, firstly, the sluggish growth of the economy, but secondly, the creation of employment. Now, there are three things which we have to point out. One is that, and I saw what other concerned citizens were saying in the clips that you've played, talking about the skills shortage and all of that. But if you look at the data and look specifically at the quarterly labor force survey and the quarterly employment statistics, which was released a few weeks ago, you'll realize that what we have here is a problem of the failure of the economy to be able to create jobs and absorb the number of people who are entering the jobs market, either as a result of leaving education institutions or because they are quitting out of school and they're merely becoming of working age group. And such is the numbers which we see, but we can be able to ascertain here that the failure of the economy to be able to create jobs is what is creating problems of labor absorption rate in the economy itself. And you can see this also by looking at the number of part-time jobs that were created, as reported in the quarterly employment statistics a few weeks ago, that what you have here is an economy that constantly, as a result of the structural logic of capitalism's growth, you find firstly that the businesses, in order for them to be able to grow, be competitive and drive the unit cost of the products they produce, they've got to continuously seek innovation and technological machinery. And that on its own creates displacement of labor. But secondly, on top of that, you have the business corporations which are refusing to invest in the economy. Yeah. In fact, if you look at the capital formation...
Trevor, let's hold it there for now. I want to bring in Matshidiso before we come into, just interrogating the factors there. Matshidiso, I mean, you're hearing what Trevor is saying, and we also, have been listening to other analysts saying that the tide may be turning soon. But, when you look at just some of the numbers and you interrogate them in terms of who is most affected. Some are saying that it actually is a crisis when you consider that in the main it is black women who are most affected by these numbers. In terms of the unemployment, we're looking at, especially in the recent stats, over 50%, in that grouping. Where do you think the conversations should need to be coming in now in terms of looking at what, we can do for especially black women in this country?
Thank you for having us. But it is true that these reports or this quarterly survey has come and during Women's Month, which is really just sad and just highlights the plight of women in this country. So yes, the unemployment rate has risen, but this has been a structural problem and has been a problem persistently in our economy for many decades actually, and we've been unable to solve that. Our economy has not been able to create meaningful employment for most people in this country, particularly for women. And so if we are to do more than pay lip service for the women in this country, we need to actually solve unemployment. This is a powerful way to do that, to just beyond saying, oh, we value you, but to actually show that. And one of the problems, and I think the previous speaker, Trevor, had mentioned that these are structural. And so our interventions to resolving unemployment tend to overlook sectors where women are most, the labor force is predominantly women, or just the work of women. So women's work and our care work, for example, and how we are most represented in the informal economy, the care economy, those kind of areas. And if we really are to solve that, we need to be thinking about inclusive growth, like genuine growth, where we have representation and that foregrounds women's the rights for women, because in doing that we'll actually solve that unemployment problem, because women and young black women are disproportionately represented in the unemployment statistics.
Trevor, I want to look at, just the sectors that have been doing well and those that have not. Interestingly enough, the formal sector has been found to have shed more jobs than the informal sector. But when you look at the trade sector, particularly in this period under review, 111,000 jobs were shed in the trade sector and 45,000 in agriculture. You speak about having an environment that is conducive enough to create employment. Just talk about what these numbers are telling us in terms of these sectors.
Look, these sectors are affected by the cyclical fluctuations, which often result from, for instance, let's take maybe one sector after the other. If you look, for instance, at agriculture, which also shows a shedding of jobs, we know that employment in the agricultural sector is, of course, cyclical, depending on the harvesting and the cultivation periods. But two, if you look at utilities and trade, we know that in those particular areas, mostly people there are guided by the strong demand. So because mostly they are based on whether the consumption of the services they are offering is consumed, or rather whether the services they are providing or delivering is consumed, whether the products they are providing are consumed. Now, if you look at the South African Reserve Bank's bulletin for quarter one, you'll realize that effective demand actually has been on a decline. And the reason the effective demand has been on a decline is because of a number of issues. But the impact of that on the sectors, trade and utilities, is quite felt throughout, because these are the people who ought to consume from the small business enterprises which are dominating such particular sectors. Now, if you have demand that is knocked as a result of other problems in the economy, mostly because of the reduction in the disposable income that households of working class are having, is going to have ripple effects in how those particular businesses operate. So we think that what can be set to account for the decline in those particular sectors is mainly the decline in effective demand. And the reason why effective demand is declining, as we have said, is because of the rising cost of living, but also the rise in interest rates. So it is on those particular bases that such particular businesses, when they are not doing well, they are going to have to opt for two things. One, they are going to have to reduce input costs. And part of that, unfortunately, the capitalist political economy classifies the labor power as one of the input costs. And as a result, the reduction in input costs by extension mean that there has to be reduction in the number of workers who are employed in such particular business enterprise. So we think that the reduction in employment in those particular sectors is mainly as a result of the decline in effective demand.
Yeah, and I want to talk about your role as unions, just before we wrap up our conversation. But perhaps let me bring it back to you, Matshidiso. And I mean, I'm not targeting our conversation just on women, but you did pen a very interesting article not too long ago, just speaking particularly about key policies that really need to be introduced to structure certain jobs, to skew and favor women, particularly if you consider in managerial roles. We're still having women occupy, roles that are not nearly as dominant as what we would want to see going forward, especially in the industries that we are talking about now and the sectors we are talking about now that Trevor also mentioned. But just talk to us about what are some of the key interventions that then need to be introduced for women to start occupying, especially in the key industries top positions?
Sure. So I think that's a really important point to recognize, because yes, in unemployment statistics, we're overrepresented, but even in employment, there's a gender pay gap. There's so many issues of, we know as women, the struggles that we go through being even in the sector. There's so many barriers for women's economic participation. And that's why it's crucial, especially now being Women's Month, to adequately reflect like how we need solutions now, and we need to be more solution orientated. And there are ways to do that. Gender mainstreaming and gender responsive budgeting. So looking at our fiscal policy so that we can invest in skills and invest in sectors where women are represented. That is a very powerful way and has been found to be a powerful way to do that. And we look forward to a more gender responsive budget in the medium term budget speech later this year. But also, in addition to that, we should be actually scaling that gender responsiveness and gender mainstreaming to every other form of our economic policy interventions. That includes our industrial policy, our monetary policy, all of that, and really remove the way of thinking. And I think it was Neva Makhetla who actually said that we need to move from thinking of industry as men in hard hats and start thinking, if we're going to transform our industry and we're going to grow in a way that's actually inclusive, we need to start bringing in the women who make up more than half of the population but are also disproportionately represented in unemployment statistics and also in the informal sector. We need to start bringing in that unpaid work that women do and start recognizing our lived experiences. Yes, we're impacted by socioeconomic crises, poverty, inequality, unemployment in the country. Everyone is, but there is a disproportionate and a different way that different people in this country are affected. And it's time for our policy to foreground that and to recognize that.
Trevor, as we wrap up our conversation, of course, there has been some form of pushback, particularly from the private sector, in as far as your role as unions and how conducive you make it in terms of negotiating for, workers' rights, etc. When it comes to, especially for workers to remain employed, essentially, and also for employers to be able to afford, keeping those that are desperately needed in the industry.
Look, what business is requesting of us is something we can never concede to as the trade union movement, because what they are demanding of us is to accept that the cost of labor has to be driven down and the price of labor has to be as cheaply as possible. The reason for that is because they think we are responsible for the high unemployment rates because we've made labor very expensive. But that is not true, because what we've got to look at, and this is a point we've been making for the past years, we've been saying that labor has to be charged on the basis of the value it takes to produce it. So the basic necessities that goes into making the labor power that eventually gets to work tomorrow and is able to render the services that are required has to be the determining factor in determining the prices of the labor power, not the vestiges of demand and supply as the employers would want us to agree to. So we won't agree to that, but also we don't want to agree to the narrative that we are, because of the high cost, the so-called high cost of labor power, we are responsible for unemployment, because we think that they are responsible for unemployment. If you look at the gross fixed capital formation, it has been going down in the past 10 years. And in fact, after COVID-19 in 2021, it went a little bit up, but we have seen through the bulletins of the South African Reserve Bank that the investment, the share of investments from the private sector has dropped. The reason it has dropped is because they're looking for de-risking models. In other words, they want the government to de-risk their investments and to back and guarantee those private sector investments so that it can allow them to reap profits at the expense of socializing such particular risks of investments. So we are disagreeing with that particular value. We think that it is the private sector which is not investing and has been embarking on an investment strike since 2014 that has created a problem where we can't have economic growth and create jobs for our people.
All right, Trevor, well understood. Trevor, let me thank you for your contribution and your time. Thank you so much. Trevor Shaku is a spokesperson for the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Matshidiso, let's wrap our conversation now. I mean, when you look at the numbers, and the numbers do tell an interesting story that we've been seeing coming out today, 8.4 million unemployed actively looking for work. You've got 3.2 million discouraged workers who obviously have tried, but, you know, nothing has come to pass. You've got over 800,000 who did not find any form of unemployment for whatever reason, and they've just stopped looking. I mean, these numbers are high. When we look at young people who want to come into the job market, I mean, what are some of the things that they should also be considering, just looking at how the economy is really not performing where it should be, you know, first of all, and also, you know, some of the contributions that Trevor has also made, just very quickly as we wrap our conversation in terms of that advice for young people.
Sure. So, I mean, it's a really difficult time. I mean, it's always been, because unemployment has been persistent in our country, but it's a particularly difficult time for young people in this country. And so it is important to not personalize this and realize that this is structural, this is an economic failure, but really to equip ourselves with the skills to be able to actively address that. So taking advantage of opportunities or hard-gained victories that we have in the form of public participation, leaning in and participating and actively making submissions, for example, to Parliament, to relevant departments, you know, and just standing up and highlighting that this is a structural problem, and it's no longer that, oh, you didn't study hard enough or your marks were not good enough. This is clearly an economic thing and not individualized, and it's very important for young people to remember that, and to also just take this step and come together, really, so that we can come together and like come up with solutions so that we don't continue this, you know, like advance this legacy, this entrenched legacy, that with our generation we can actually overcome these things that have been plaguing our economy for the past 30 years, but also even before that.
Matshidiso, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Matshidiso Lencoasa, Chairperson for the Budget Justice Coalition and Budget Researcher for Section 27 there. And of course, earlier we had Saftu Trevor Shaku.